Most Christians believe that when they die, something inside them, their soul, leaves the body and goes somewhere, heaven, the presence of God, some other place beyond death. But the Hebrew Bible, the entire Old Testament, never actually says that. The word your English Bible translates as soul comes from a Hebrew word that meant something so different. Understanding it changes how you read every passage about death, life, and what survives. And the moment when soul, the meaning you carry now, replaced what the original text said happened over 2,000 years ago in a translation library in Alexandria, Egypt. What was lost in that translation has shaped what hundreds of millions of Christians believe about death ever since, and almost nobody today has been shown the original. Here's what's strange. The Hebrew word at the center of this isn't rare. It appears in the Old Testament over 750 times. It's in the first verses of Genesis. It's in the Psalms. It's in the prophets. Almost every English passage where you read soul, that word is there, in the Hebrew, underneath. But the Hebrew word nephesh doesn't mean what English speakers mean by soul. It doesn't mean an immaterial part of you that survives the body. It doesn't mean a separable spirit. The original text isn't talking about that. It's talking about something more physical, more grounded, and stranger than that. And once you see it, the entire question of what happens when you die starts to look different. Most pastors won't tell you this, not because they're hiding it, but because they don't know. Seminary doesn't usually go this deep into the Hebrew. The translation history isn't taught in most churches. So when you read your Bible and see the word soul, what you're actually reading is the end of a chain of decisions made by people over centuries in places like Alexandria and Rome and Wittenberg. Let's start with what nephesh actually meant. The Hebrew word nephesh spelled has its roots in the body, specifically in the throat and the neck, the place where breathing happens, the place where swallowing happens. One of the foundational modern scholars on this is Hans Walter Wolff. In 1973, Wolff published a book called Anthropology of the Old Testament. In it, Wolff documented every appearance of nephesh in the Hebrew Bible over 700 primary uses. He found that the word almost always carries this corporeal grounding. It's about the living body, not separate from it. Nephesh means breath. It means the throat that breathes. It means hunger, thirst, the appetite that needs to be filled. It means desire, the part of you that wants. It means life, the actual life happening in the body. And it means the whole living person, not a component of them. Watch what happens in the second chapter of Genesis. God forms the human from the dust of the ground. Then God breathes into the human's nostrils the breath of life. And then the Hebrew text says, Vayehi ha'adam lenefesh hayah. In English Bibles, you usually see this as, and the man became a living soul. Some newer translations say, a living being. Both are pointing at the same Hebrew phrase. But look closely at the verb. The text says the human became a nephesh, not received one, not was given one, became one. The human is the nephesh, not has one. And here's something almost nobody knows. That exact same phrase, nephesh hayah, living being, appears 4 other times in Genesis chapter 1. Not for humans, for the fish, for the birds, for the cattle, for the wild animals. In the Hebrew Bible, the thing King James English translates as a unique human soul is the same thing every living animal also is. The text does not lexically distinguish them. And if you doubt this, consider the book of Numbers, chapter 6, verse 6. The text discusses ritual purity, and it warns against approaching a dead nephesh, a corpse. A corpse is called a nephesh, which means nephesh cannot mean the soul that left the body at death, because the corpse left behind, lifeless, is itself called a nephesh in the text. The biblical scholar James Barr Oxford Vanderbilt put it this way. In his 1992 book, The Garden of Eden and the Hope of Immortality, Barr wrote that in the Hebrew Bible, humans do not have a nephesh, they are one. And in Hebrew poetry Job, the Psalm's nephesh is placed in parallel with basar, the Hebrew word for flesh, not in opposition to it. The Hebrew picture is integration, not division. The person is one thing. So if the Hebrew Bible doesn't have an immortal soul that survives death, where did the Christian doctrine come from? Because somebody, somewhere, made the choice to take this Hebrew concept of an integrated living being and turn it into the Greek concept of an immortal soul. And that choice, once it was made, quietly rewrote the next 2,000 years of Christian theology. To find that moment, you have to leave Jerusalem. You have to travel west, to a city built by Alexander the Great, sitting on the Mediterranean coast, in Egypt. Alexandria. Around 250 before the Common Era, about 250 years before Jesus was born, something happened in Alexandria that quietly changed how the Bible would be read forever. A group of Jewish scholars sat down to do something that, on the surface, looked like simple translation work. What they did instead was carry a piece of Greek philosophy directly into the sacred text, and almost nobody then or since has noticed. By the 3rd century before Christ, most Jews living in Alexandria no longer spoke Hebrew. Greek had become the everyday language of the Mediterranean world. The Jewish community of Alexandria, one of the largest in the ancient world, needed a Greek version of their own scriptures. So a group of scholars, traditionally said to be 72 elders sent from Jerusalem, began translating the Hebrew Bible into Koine Greek. The translation is called the Septuagint, from the Latin word for 70, after the 72 elders of the legend. Scholars now think it was actually translated piecemeal by many translators over more than 100 years. But however it happened, the result is the same. When the Septuagint translators reached the Hebrew word nephesh, they had to find a Greek word that fit, and the closest Greek word available was psyche. Here's the problem. In Greek philosophical thought, especially the writing of Plato, who had lived a century earlier, psyche did not mean what nephesh meant in Hebrew. For Plato, in dialogues like the Phaedo, psyche was the immortal, immaterial part of a person, the part that pre-existed the body, the part that escaped at death, the part that in the philosopher's life was being prepared to leave. When the Septuagint translators chose psyche to translate nephesh, they were not betraying the text, they were choosing the only Greek word available for the inner life of a person. But Plato's ghost wrote along with the word, and from that moment forward, anyone reading the Greek Old Testament was reading nephesh through a Platonic lens. By the 1st century, a Jewish philosopher in Alexandria named Philo would read the Septuagint and explicitly interpret it through Platonic philosophy. For Philo, the psyche of Genesis is read in Platonic terms, the immortal, immaterial dimension of a person that Plato's philosophy described. And then came Christianity. The earliest Christians, Greek-speaking, scattered across the Roman world, read their Old Testament in the Septuagint version. They read about nephesh in Greek as psyche. By the 2nd century, Christian thinkers like Justin Martyr were arguing that Plato had read Moses and that Christian doctrine and Platonic philosophy were two streams of the same truth. In the 3rd century, the theologian Origen, based fittingly in Alexandria, built one of the first systematic Christian theologies, and he carried Platonic elements directly into it, including the idea that souls existed before the body. But the decisive figure came 2 centuries later. Augustine of Hippo, 4th and 5th century, North Africa. Bishop, philosopher, and one of the most influential writers in the history of Western thought. Augustine had been deeply trained in Neoplatonism, the late form of Platonic philosophy taught by Plotinus and Porphyry. When he converted to Christianity, he brought that philosophical training with him. In Augustine's writing, the human soul is taught as created immortal, independent of the body, and superior to it. The body becomes the temporary container, the soul, the eternal essence. This is fully Platonic, and once Augustine wrote it into the architecture of Western Christian theology, it locked in. For the next 1,500 years, the immortal soul doctrine sat at the center of Christian teaching about death. Until Hans Walter Wolff in 1973 went back to the Hebrew text and asked, systematically, whether the Old Testament actually taught any of this. So if the Hebrew Bible doesn't say what most Christians today think it says about death, what does it actually say? The Hebrew word for the place the dead go is Sheol. It appears 66 times in the Old Testament. Sheol is described as a place below a land of dust, of shadow, of gloom. It is the destination of the dead, all the dead, the righteous and the unrighteous, the rich and the poor. Jacob expects to descend to Sheol mourning. David, after losing a child, says he will go to Sheol. The Psalms describe Sheol with sorrow, not with separation. In the Hebrew picture, when you die, your Nephesh ends. Your body returns to the dust it was made from. Your breath returns to God who gave it. The integrated living being you were, simply, is no longer. Ecclesiastes puts it bluntly. Chapter 12, verse 7. The dust returns to the earth as it was, and the breath returns to God who gave it. That verse is the reversal of Genesis 2:7. It's the undoing of becoming a Nephesh. But, and this matters, the Hebrew Bible does not leave the story there. In one of the latest texts of the Old Testament, written around 165 years before Christ, the book of Daniel, a new idea appears. Chapter 12, verse 2. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. This is resurrection, bodily resurrection. The dead in the dust, awakening, not as escaped souls floating somewhere else, as whole, embodied beings restored to the earth. And that is the Christian hope, as the first followers of Jesus actually understood it. Long before Augustine, long before Plato infiltrated the doctrine. The hope is not that your soul leaves and goes somewhere. The hope is resurrection. N.T. Wright, biblical scholar, former Bishop of Durham, one of the most respected New Testament scholars alive, has argued this for decades. In his book Surprised by Hope, Wright shows that the Christian hope was never about escaping the body. It was about the body and the world being made new. Resurrection, not soul ascent. New creation, not soul flight. Which means reading the Hebrew Bible without the Greek lens doesn't make Christian faith poorer. It makes it stranger, more material, more grounded. The Hebrew picture is one in which you are a unified being, body, breath, life, all one, Nephesh. And the deepest hope is not that part of you escapes that wholeness, it's that the whole of you is restored. That's what the original text says. That's what the first Christians believed. That's what got buried, slowly, under 2,000 years of philosophical inheritance, until scholars went back to the Hebrew and uncovered it again. If you want to keep going deeper into what the original texts actually say, what was lost in translation, and what biblical scholarship is recovering, subscribe. There's a lot more to unveil.